There is a spot in central Moscow where 3 buildings have stood in the last 100 years. First a cathedral, then a hole in the ground, then a swimming pool, then the same cathedral again. What was supposed to stand there was none of these. It was supposed to be the tallest building on Earth, topped by a statue 3 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. Stalin approved it personally. Construction started. Then Germany invaded. Almost built. Case number 41. The tower Stalin buried. Boris Iofan was 40 years old in the winter of 1931. He was a Soviet architect. He had already designed Stalin's dacha in Crimea. He had already built the house on the embankment, the massive gray apartment complex where the party elite lived, and later, where many of them disappeared in the night. He knew how to build for the state. In February 1931, Stalin announced an international competition. Every major architect in the world was invited. The goal: design a building that would be the physical heart of the new Soviet civilization. Something to prove Soviet engineering could match anything the capitalists had ever built. Something to prove socialism had arrived to stay. 272 architects submitted plans over the next 2 years. Le Corbusier submitted a horizontal glass and steel machine, low and modern. Walter Gropius from the Bauhaus submitted something similar. Erich Mendelsohn sent a curved international-style building. Frank Lloyd Wright received an invitation but declined. Iofan submitted something none of them expected. His design was a stepped ziggurat, wedding cake in profile, rising 415 meters into the sky. Concentric tiers of white marble and granite, windows arranged in vertical bands, every element pointing upward. And on top, replacing a spire or a dome, he drew something no architect in history had ever dared to draw at building scale. A statue of Lenin, 100 meters tall, larger than the Statue of Liberty, larger than anything ever built by human hands. The total height was 515 meters, 50 meters taller than the Empire State Building. Stalin looked at every entry personally. He picked Iofan's. The Soviet Union in 1931 believed it was going to overtake the world in a decade. The first 5-year plan had transformed the country in ways nobody outside its borders quite believed. Steel production had doubled. 1,500 new factories had been built from scratch. Entire industrial cities had risen in the Urals and Siberia, where nothing existed 3 years earlier. American engineers came to Moscow to consult on projects. German engineers came to teach concrete technique. The Dnieper Dam in Ukraine was rising as the largest hydroelectric project in Europe. Moscow itself was being torn apart and rebuilt as a socialist capital. Nothing seemed impossible. The old Russia was being physically erased. The Bolsheviks had already destroyed thousands of churches, thousands of monasteries, thousands of private estates. Peter the Great's imperial capital of St. Petersburg had been renamed twice. Streets were renamed daily. Names of towns were changed to honor party leaders, who were themselves erased 6 months later when they fell from favor. In this environment, building the tallest building on Earth, topped by a 100-meter statue of a dead man, was not extravagant. It was the logical next step. There was one obstacle. The site Iofan had chosen for the palace was already occupied. In the exact center of Moscow, 100 meters from the Kremlin, on the banks of the Moscow River, stood the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, built between 1839 and 1883 to commemorate Russia's victory over Napoleon. One of the largest Orthodox cathedrals in the world. For 50 years it had been the spiritual center of Imperial Russia. It would have to come down. The Politburo voted to demolish it on July 16, 1931, 5 days after they announced the competition, before any winner had been chosen, before any final design had been reviewed. The decision was made in advance. Whatever building went there would replace whatever had stood there before. Here's what almost was. On the morning of December 5, 1931, engineers packed dynamite into the base of the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. Photographers arrived. A film crew arrived. The demolition was going to be filmed and shown across the country as propaganda, the old world being physically destroyed to make room for the new. The first charge detonated at 10 in the morning. The cathedral did not fall. Its walls were 3.5 meters thick, solid stone reinforced with iron bands from the imperial era, built to last 500 years. It absorbed the first charge without visible damage. They packed larger charges, detonated again. Cracks appeared, but the walls held. It took the demolition crew 45 days of repeated blasting to bring the cathedral down. Eyewitnesses reported that neighborhoods a kilometer away could feel the vibrations. Windows shattered. Old women wept in the streets. Priests were arrested for standing in silent prayer near the site. By late January 1932, all that remained was rubble. They cleared it away in 7 months. The site was ready. Iofan's design had already beaten 271 international submissions in the first round. In the second round, the judges narrowed it to 3 finalists: Iofan, an American named Hector Hamilton, and a Russian collective led by Zholtovsky. Le Corbusier had been eliminated in round 1. He was furious. He wrote a public letter to Stalin arguing that Iofan's design was aesthetically backward, that it worshipped monumentality over function, that it belonged in the 19th century rather than the 20th. Stalin read the letter. He did not reply. Iofan's design won the third and final round in May 1933, but Stalin was not satisfied with the design as originally submitted. He wanted the Lenin statue to be bigger, much bigger. He personally instructed Iofan to increase the height from 30 meters to 100 meters. He instructed that Lenin's outstretched arm point westward toward Europe. Iofan revised. He raised the total height from 300 meters to 515, the tallest structure ever proposed. Stalin approved the final design in March 1934. Construction was authorized to begin. Nobody had ever built a foundation for a structure this heavy. The full palace, including the Lenin statue, would weigh approximately 1.5 million tons. On soft alluvial soil, on the bank of a river, in the geological instability of central Moscow. The foundation had to distribute this weight across a base large enough to prevent the entire structure from sinking or tilting. Iofan's engineers designed a circular reinforced concrete foundation 140 meters across, excavated to a depth of 21 meters, ringed with continuous piles driven 40 meters into the bedrock beneath the alluvial soil. Excavation began in September 1937. For 18 months, the site swallowed steam shovels, cranes, and dumping trucks. Thousands of workers descended into the pit in shifts around the clock. The excavation displaced more earth than any single construction project in Russian history. By spring 1939, the foundation ring was complete. The concrete pour began. 3,000 cubic meters poured per week for 8 months. By early 1941, the foundation was ready to bear the tower. The steel skeleton began to rise. While the tower was excavated, another team was solving a different impossibility. How do you build a statue 100 meters tall? The Statue of Liberty is 46 meters. Christ the Redeemer in Rio is 30. No statue in human history had ever exceeded 50 meters. Iofan's Lenin would be twice as tall as anything ever built. His sculptors, led by Sergei Merkurov, spent 4 years working on the problem. They built a full-scale plaster model of Lenin's head. Just the head. It stood 8 meters high. They shipped it to a hangar in Moscow where visitors could stand inside and look out through the empty eyes at the city outside. The statue would be constructed from stainless steel plates over an internal steel frame, similar to how the Statue of Liberty was built, but scaled up by a factor of 4. Merkurov calculated it would require 6,000 tons of steel just for the outer skin. By 1941, most of the internal framework was already fabricated and stored in warehouses on the outskirts of Moscow. It never left those warehouses. Every architect who worked on the project understood the danger. 9 of Iofan's original design collaborators from the 1931 competition were arrested during the Great Terror between 1936 and 1938. 4 were executed. 3 died in labor camps. 2 were released after 1953 and refused to speak about their work for the rest of their lives. The purges did not stop at architects. 6 of the engineering supervisors on the foundation project were arrested in 1938. 3 of them were shot within weeks. Their replacements arrived without any handover of technical knowledge. Iofan himself was never arrested. He was too visible, too closely associated with Stalin's personal choice, too public a face of the project. But he lived every day expecting the knock at the door. His notebooks from this period, later donated to the State Museum of Architecture, contain page after page of clean architectural drawings interrupted every few pages by full paragraphs of Iofan writing praise of Stalin in his own hand. He was hedging. It was not enough for many of the men working around him, but between the foundation completion in 1939 and the German invasion in 1941, there was a moment when Iofan believed he was going to see it happen. May 1, 1940, May Day, the great annual celebration of Soviet power. Stalin ordered that the current progress of the Palace of Soviets be publicly celebrated as part of the parade. Iofan prepared a briefing document with photographs of the completed foundation and the first 15 stories of erected steel. He mounted a physical scale model 4 meters tall in the reviewing area of Red Square. He arranged for Kliment Voroshilov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, to formally address the crowd about the coming completion of the palace. 200,000 people passed through Red Square that day. Foreign journalists photographed the model. Newsreel footage was distributed to embassies around the world, showing the model beside the actual construction site with its rising steel frame. The completion date announced was 1945. By that date, the Palace of Soviets would be the tallest building on Earth, 50 meters taller than the Empire State Building, topped by a statue larger than any ever built, visible from 20 kilometers away in every direction. Iofan spent the summer of 1940 refining the interior plans. The grand auditorium alone would seat 21,000 people. The building would contain more than 100 kilometers of internal corridors. Its electrical requirements would exceed the entire pre-1930 power consumption of central Moscow. He was 50 years old. He had been working on this for 9 years. He was 3 years away from seeing it finished. In January 1941, Molotov signed the preemptive non-aggression pact addendum with Germany, buying additional time. Stalin believed war would not come until 1942 at earliest. Iofan believed he had that window to top out the steel frame. He was wrong by 1 year. June 22, 1941. 4:15 in the morning. 3 million German soldiers, 4,000 tanks, and 4,500 aircraft crossed the Soviet border along a 1,500-kilometer front. It was the largest military operation in human history. Within 72 hours, the entire economic priority of the Soviet Union had been rewritten. One war killed it. By July, every construction crane in Moscow had been requisitioned for defensive engineering. By August, the palace's 15-story steel skeleton was being cut down section by section. The steel was hauled east to Chelyabinsk and Magnitogorsk, where it was melted, rolled into anti-tank barriers, and shipped back west to be planted in the fields outside Moscow to stop the German advance. The pieces of Iofan's tower are still buried in those fields. By October 1941, Wehrmacht advance units were within 50 kilometers of Moscow. The scale model was evacuated. Iofan's blueprints were sealed and shipped to Corbusier, the emergency wartime capital on the Volga. Half of Iofan's design team was drafted into the army. 15 of them did not return. The foundation remained, empty, filled with rainwater, ringed by the concrete piles, for 16 years. When Stalin died on March 5, 1953, the palace was no longer in the state plan. Nobody had officially canceled it. Nobody had officially continued it. It sat in bureaucratic limbo, an empty concrete circle in the center of Moscow, 21 meters deep and 140 meters across, filling with weeds and stagnant water. On July 19, 1958, 5 years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev issued Decree 707. The Palace of Soviets project was formally canceled. Its budget lines were closed. Its remaining materials were reassigned to housing construction. The foundation site was to be repurposed. Khrushchev had an idea for what to do with the hole. He converted it into a swimming pool. The Moskva pool opened in 1960. Circular, matching the foundation dimensions exactly, 130 meters in diameter, heated year-round, open to the public every day of the year. Even in Moscow winter at -20 Celsius, Muscovites could swim outdoors, surrounded by steam rising off the water, laps of the pool tracing the perimeter of what would have been Stalin's tower. It was, at the time, the largest outdoor heated swimming pool in the world. It remained in use for 34 years. An entire generation of Muscovites learned to swim there. Grandmothers taught grandchildren in the shallow section. Old men swam competitive laps at dawn. Couples met at the pool and married. Wedding photos were taken with the massive circular perimeter in the background. Almost none of them knew what the pool had been built on. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the pool was already deteriorating. Corrosion from the chemically treated water had eaten into the original 1930s concrete rebar. The pool was closed in 1994. That year, the Russian Orthodox Church proposed rebuilding the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, on the exact site where Stalin had destroyed it in 1931. Construction began in 1995 and finished in 2000. The new cathedral is a replica of the original. Same dimensions, same white marble facade, same golden domes. From the street, unless you know the story, you would think it had stood there for 200 years. Below its foundation, 21 meters down, the original Palace of Soviets foundation is still intact. The concrete piles are still driven into the bedrock. The circular ring of the foundation is still there. Preservation surveys conducted in 2007 confirmed the entire structure remains sound, isolated by waterproof membranes and the layered floor of the reconstructed cathedral above. Every tourist who walks into Christ the Saviour Cathedral today is standing on top of the largest unfinished foundation in the history of construction. Almost none of them know it. Boris Iofan lived until 1976. He continued to design revised versions of the palace throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Smaller, more modest. Repositioned to different sites in Moscow, he submitted new proposals to Khrushchev, to Brezhnev. Nobody replied. His final drawings, from 1974, propose a much shorter version of the tower to be built on the Lenin Hills overlooking Moscow. He was 83 years old. He was still drawing. When he died in his Moscow apartment on March 11, 1976, his desk was covered in current year revisions of the Palace of Soviets. The blueprints still exist. There is a spot in central Moscow where 3 buildings have stood in the last 100 years: a cathedral, a hole, a swimming pool, the same cathedral again. What was supposed to stand there was none of these. It was supposed to be the tallest building in the world, topped by a statue 3 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. The foundation is still down there, 21 meters deep, filled with concrete. Nobody digs it up. Nobody talks about it. The tower was never built.